All right, everybody, it's the morning after. Last night before we went home, we got the final run on the world's most powerful naturally aspirated LS engine, this Hemi-headed 424 cubic inch LS engine. And today I'm going to take you with me as we do the breakdown and check everything over and kind of show you what's inside this thing. So come along. All right, well, if you're just new to this project, let me tell you a little bit about this engine. This is about 4 years of work for me going into this thing. What we have here is an all aluminum LS package. So basically we have a aluminum Dart LS next block. We've got a billet daily dry sump. I've got a billet front cover that's housing the RCD gear drive. We've got the cast Hammerhead Hemi cylinder heads on this thing. We've got billet covers that were made by my buddy Chris Urachko. I got a billet manifold made by my buddy Aaron Tremaine at Next Gen Engineering in Australia. Everything about this engine is custom, one-off, and made for a single purpose to make a crazy amount of power naturally aspirated. This thing turns about 10,500 RPM. It is EFI fuel injected. It looks like carburetors, but these are really EFI throttle bodies that have injectors in there. So this thing's 424 cubic inches. It's destined for a drag and drive application that's going to be incredible. So you're going to see this thing out there running around and not just be a dyno queen. And so after 4 years, we finally ran this thing, and I struggled and struggled to get it to run well on the dyno. Went through a couple different camshafts, struggled with ignition misfires, and finally got all those problems solved, and it exceeded our expectations. I always knew this thing had the kind of capability of making 1,200 horsepower, but you know, you almost don't want to hope for that, right? It seems too good to be true. Darren Morgan did the cylinder head port and stuff for me, and we talked a lot about how that might happen, but I was very cautious about that. But after a bunch of work, turns out it's pretty much there. So we're going to take a look at the dyno sheets. We're going to talk a little bit about the numbers and tell you what I think, and maybe you can comment about what you think. Okay, so I want to take a few minutes and share with you guys the dyno data. Everybody sees the big numbers at the end. It made 1,198 horsepower, the dyno recorded for us, made 664 foot-pounds. But I want to point out that that isn't exactly how much torque it made. It probably makes another 10 or 15 more than that, or even a couple more one way or the other, because we actually started the dyno pull above where peak torque is. Peak torque's probably somewhere around anywhere between 79 and 81 or 8,200 on this thing. And we actually started the dyno pull at about 82 or 8,300. So it starts, you can see there, it starts recording about 8,500, goes out to a little past 10,000 RPM. So the reality is, while that's fantastic torque number, we probably have just slightly more than that even. So I'm really proud of this thing. To make 1.6 or so foot-pounds for every cubic inch naturally aspirated is absolutely outstanding. And again, we always knew it had the potential. Everything we did about this engine was custom one-off. It has custom pistons, it has custom one-off rocker arms, custom manifold. It was a long, drawn-out, it was the longest engine build I've ever participated in, and it had such a roller coaster of up and down emotions. But here's the thing. Nobody ever believes dyno sheets, including me. Like, I'm always skeptical when I see other people's dyno sheets, and so when it comes to my own, I have to be fair and apply that same level of skepticism. Nobody doubts the accuracy of my dyno more than me. And so I'm always looking for, how can I verify? How can I validate? There's all kinds of trickery and things that people can do to make their dyno numbers look better. I don't want to be that guy, because I don't want to show up at the racetrack and have an engine that supposedly makes great power that doesn't run very good. And so you can fake a lot of things, right? Like you can put the weather station in a, in a not ideal area. You can tweak the scaling on your dyno torque and all that kind of stuff. But the one thing you can never fake, really, is fuel flow. And so I'm always looking at the fuel flow. What's great about my dyno is we use a positive displacement fuel flow meter. And when I have an ECU, like for example, the Holley EFI, it also reports in fuel flow. And we get very, very good correlation between those values, usually within a couple of pounds per hour of fuel flow. So for example, if I take a look here, one of the things that you're going to notice if I bring up this dyno sheet here is this little kink right at the end. Now, if you've watched my my Facebook videos and stuff, you can hear at the end of the dyno pull, it's going up, you know, it's going rah. When it gets to the top, the engine kind of like slips a little bit, like releases. And I'll show you guys in a few minutes what happened. There's a little water plug in the back of the water brake on the dyno. It actually stripped the threads and blew out. And when that happened, it dumped a bunch of water out, so it lost some of the load. Now, a couple things happen. First of all, your engine kind of loses all its load and zooms up. Second of all, the torque, because of that, drops down, and then it affects your tune-up in your engine. So we can see in the data where the closed loop tried to pull a bunch of fuel out of the thing. It's got this big dip right here where it goes and comes back. And so realistically, this thing probably made slightly over 1,200 horsepower, but I don't care. I'm not going to argue that. I'm not going to fight it. I'm just going to go, are these numbers even realistic, right? So as I scroll over here, I'm going to come up to my peak. I got 9,840 RPM right there, and it shows me at that point 1,191 horsepower. So if I scroll down here, I want to make sure I don't have some crazy correction factor. Like I'm here in Arizona, I don't want my correction factor to be looking like I'm in Denver or something, and that's a way that you can kind of skew the numbers. And I don't want to use the term cheat, but you know what I mean. So when I look at my correction factor here, I can see we had ambient temperature of about 74 degrees, about 98 kPa of barometric pressure. I had 17% relative humidity. That works out to a correction factor of 5.62%. Now, if you're not familiar with dynos, your dyno measures the actual power you made in that day in that room, and that's called the observed power. But the number that shows up on your screen is the corrected power. And you can turn that on or off. For example, you can see here it's 1191. If I go down here and I tell it not to show the corrected data, it actually produced 1,127 horsepower, right? So if I grab my calculator and I come over here and I look at that same RPM and fuel flow, it's using about 530 pounds per hour of fuel flow, right? So if I say 530 divided by the actual 1,127 horsepower, gives me a brake-specific fuel consumption of 0.47. So obviously then I've got a 5.6% correction factor. So you've got to take your fuel flow and divide it by your raw power, not your corrected power. That will skew your brake specific numbers. But basically, the fuel flow meter on my dyno agrees almost exactly with the fuel flow that's calculated by the Holley. That brake specific number is extremely normal for a Q16 oxygenated fuel. A lot of people don't know that. If you have an oxygenated fuel, you have to use more of it. Think about changing from gasoline to E85 or methanol. As your fuel quantity goes up, your brake specific fuel consumption gets worse in terms of efficiency. So whereas you might see a pro stock engine be 0.38 or 0.39 or 0.40, you're really never going to get there that way when you have an oxygenated fuel. So I feel like 0.47 brake specific, pretty dang good, very realistic. It means that my 1,127 raw horsepower corrected at 5.6% or so gives me 1,191. So you know what? I believe that. I think that's a rational, realistic number. So I'll tell you what, now that I feel like I can trust the dyno, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to take you guys with me. I have not lashed this thing. I haven't checked anything over. I'm going to pull the plugs out. We'll look at them together. I'm going to pull the covers off and we'll look for any broken springs and we'll go through and check the lash. Now remember, this is the morning after. Everything's cold, so my lash is probably going to be tighter than it would be while we're running. What I'm looking for is for all the lash to be the same, but let's go see what we get.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the things that I really love about this engine that we kind of codenamed Project Hatemaker is that it makes everybody mad, right? It's a Hemi cylinder head that was originally made for a small block Ford on an LS engine. So you got the whole Chrysler, Ford, Chevy all mixed up in here. But one of the things that's cool about a Hemi is you get this huge valve cover. The downside is now your spark plug's got to go down through the middle of it. And we learned the hard way that you really have to protect the spark plug boot. Otherwise, you're going to get ignition misfires as that spark has to go way down inside a metal tube to get to the spark plug. So these are really great plugs that kind of came from the Pro Stock era. And you can grab it. And as you pull it out, it's got a little plastic grabber here. So it pulls on the bottom of the boot. Otherwise, it's like when you pull the wire and you can pull the inside of the boot apart. You don't want to do that. So these are terrific MSC Pro Stock style wires. You just grab them, pull them out. I'm going to lay them over here, and then I'm going to pull my plugs out. Just kind of give these guys a little bit of a bump to get them loose, and then I'll spin them out with the drill. I don't like to use a rattle drill and break the porcelain. Take these guys out, put them in order. Pointy end goes to the front of the engine here. And that way I can take some time and really look at them here. Okay, so I got all the plugs out. I got them in order. That gives me an opportunity to kind of look at them. And I'm getting old, so I got to take my glasses off to see really good here. But the first thing I noticed that all of them have the strap. So we're not doing too bad there. If you ever take the plugs out and that's gone, believe me, that was way too much timing. But in this case, you know, they actually don't look too bad. They're fairly evenly colored across them. Got a little bit of soot on a couple of them, but that's a function of being a carburetor style manifold, I think, from idling. But when I look at the strap and where the timing marks are, man, it's pretty close. This thing is really nice. I don't have any that are big outliers and need a bunch of individual cylinder trim or anything like that. And that's usually a good sign of a well-developed induction and exhaust system. You don't have one cylinder making 25 horsepower more than the next one, or the fueling's way off or anything like that. So I'm pretty happy with those. I feel like not only is that pretty close to being ideal, it's super safe. So at the moment, I'm not going to do a whole bunch more on the dyno. I'm going to wait until we get this thing in the car and start doing some tuning at the track, and then we'll get really picky about the tune-up. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of oil on your headers. If you're doing dyno testing, that's a problem, because now it'll smoke and you'll get that smoke back in your intake and all that, and it just hurts your power. So if I do get a bunch of oil on my headers and I want to run again, normally we got to start it up, get the headers hot, burn all that off, clean everything real good, and then we can do a dyno pull. But today it's cold, so that shouldn't be a big problem. Super nice covers my buddy Chris Urachko designed, so thanks, Chris. One of the first things I look for is valve spring material. If you've broken the valve spring or a valve spring tip or anything like that, it's normally going to be laying down here in the bottom. So I'm looking very carefully up in here. And this engine, we spent a ton of time on the Spintron. So to be honest, I'm not that surprised. On the Spintron, we were going to 10.5, 10.6, 10.7. On the engine dyno, we're only going to 10.1 or 10.2. So I'm not surprised that it looks super great. Thank goodness. It's a ton of stress with these things. Your hands are shaking at the end of the dyno pull. But just a cursory glance, 2, 4, 6, 8, look okay. Let's go see the other side. Okay, so now that we've done a good visual inspection and there's no physical broken parts in there, the next thing we're going to be looking at is how's our valve lash look? You know, how much clearance do we have in there relative to what we started with? And what our spring loads look like. Now, checking the spring loads can be difficult if you don't have the right tools. These are a couple of ones that we have made by Buxton Engineering. Man, Brad Buxton makes some sweet tools. If you don't have one of these, I promise you want one. But basically, it's a loaded hydraulic gauge here, and it's got a little hook on the end that I can go over here and I can hook onto the back side of my rocker arm, and then it's got an adjustment for the pivot length. Now, if you're not familiar with what I mean by pivot length, the pivot length of the rocker is different than the rocker ratio. So if you look at this big long exhaust rocker here, the pivot length is from the center of the trunnion to basically the center of my roller wheel out here. And I forget, I think these exhaust ones are a little over 3 inches long, which is enormously long. More typical is something like these intakes that are about 1.650 inches from that dimension to that dimension. So the rocker ratio then is the mathematical ratio of the length between the tail, you know, the tail of the rocker and the rocker's pivot length. So if, for example, you look at this, if you worked out the math, my exhaust rockers have a 1.8 rocker ratio. My intakes, on the other hand, if you look at these, they have a super short tail shaft, so they have a 2.1 rocker ratio. Now, that's one of the things that's super unique about this engine. Because these heads were originally made for small block Fords, where the push rod comes up through the head was, you know, predicated on fitting the lifter bank angles that you would have in a small block Ford. In a Chevy, where they're all 45 degrees in line, it creates a little bit of a problem because of how that push rod lays down in the head like that. So I worked really hard with Grant Holcomb at Jessel to create special rocker arms with just the right amount of geometry and angularity to make all this work. But one of the trade-offs we had to do is we need a really short tail shaft to get the push rod in the right position for the geometry we wanted. So we didn't pick a 2.1 rocker ratio. It sort of picked us. And then what I had to do is then go work with Billy Godbold and Chris Potter from Comp Cams. And we had to work out what we wanted for valve motion and work backwards from the valve motion we wanted through the rocker ratio and the geometry to work out what camshaft lobes needed to look like. And I had mentioned earlier, like I kind of got it wrong the first time. I really sort of overthought it too much and picked cam specs at the lobes rather than really being focused on what was happening at the valves. And it's tricky when you've got a 2.1 ratio there and a 1.8 ratio there, and you're trying to work out what the physical valves are doing in the engine. It gets a lot more complicated. Okay, so anyway, now that we've said that though, in order for my gauge to read properly, it's got a little swivel here that sets the pivot point anywhere from as low as about, let's see, about 1.5 all the way up to about a 2.2 inch long pivot point. So in order to get the right number on here, you want that leverage point to be set correctly. So I set this for 1.65. Now to be fair, I don't have one of these that goes all the way out to 3 or 3.2, whatever these are. So the number that I read on my exhaust side is not going to be correct. But as long as they're all the same or close to the same, then I can know that they're doing okay. But for my intakes, I should see when the rocker is on the seat. So when it's got lash in it, right? We don't want to preload the spring when I'm riding up on the lobe. When I'm on the base circle, I should be able to get somewhere around, I don't know, 425 to 450 pounds of load on the seat. So right now, I can feel 2, 4, and 6. I can see 6 has tons of lift. 8 has some clearance play, so that means it's got lash and it's on the base circle. So what I'm going to do is take this, I'm just going to hook it around the backside of the rocker arm. And as I start to pull down on this pivot, my gauge starts to go up. And I can just feel when it pops off the seat, and I'm at about 430 or 35 pounds there of force to get that valve to crack off the seat. So that's perfect. So what I'm going to do is work my way through all these. Now look, you could do this first and then check your lash, or you could check your lash first and do this. But either way, you're going to need to go through the whole engine to do it. So I'm happy with that one. I'm going to move around to the other side and find some other ones, and then I'm going to move the engine over until I get all of them on the base circle and check them all. Yeah, same thing, about 440 there. So 7. Okay, so now that I'm happy that all my springs are okay and I don't need to do any maintenance or change springs or anything, I'm gonna go ahead and start checking my lash. Remember that I'm cold today. And the other thing is when you start trying to lash these engines that have these really quote unquote big camshafts where there's a lot of overlap and you have long durations and things like that, you kind of have to be careful to make sure you are truly on the base circle. It's real easy to get off the base circle and onto that long opening or closing ramp. So one of the ways that I'll do that is I just think about the 4-stroke cycle. Now, there's a ton of guys that have tricks. I do this one, and then I spin at 180, and I do this one. You can do all that. I got no problem with it. It just means that you got to remember all the different firing orders for different engines. For me, I got plenty of battery. My starter works good, so I like to just start at one end of my engine, work to the other, and do the other side. Whatever you do is up to you. But what I'm going to do is, for example, if I want to check the number 2 cylinder, I want to think about where I'm at. So if I click the starter, I see it's just starting to close, right? So when it gets closed, that means I'm after bottom dead center, and my piston's going up on the compression stroke. So I'm going to go a little bit more. And now I'm on the power stroke. I'm at the end of the power stroke, and my exhaust is just starting to open. There's no way that these can both be open at this point. So now I can check my lash. So I got a couple of tools. When I'm lashing this thing while we're running and we're hot, I use a little holder like this made by LSM. And it's got like basically where I can put 2 in. So I make it like a go, no-go gauge. When I'm running hot, I'm looking for around 18 thou of valve lash on this engine. So that means that I've got a 18 that will go in and a 20. If my 20 will go in, I have way too much lash. But that way I can just kind of quickly check it. Okay, right now, neither one of those will go in, and that's normal because now my engine's cold. So everything's kind of shrunk back down. As it warms up and expands, what I'm looking for is that 18 thou to work. So I'm going to grab my other ones here, and I've got them spread out already, anywhere from about 10 to 17. So I'm just going to start checking. 10 goes in pretty easy. 11 goes in without too much effort. And a 12 takes a little bit of effort. So I'm going to call that 12. So what I'm looking for now is, as long as all the rest of them are pretty close to that number, I'm going to be okay. But if all of a sudden I got one that's at 18 cold or something, I need to figure out why that is. If I need to make an adjustment, I've got a lock here on the adjuster. And so what I would do is take this Allen wrench here and move the lock in or out, the adjuster in or out, but I've got to unlock it first. And I like these wrenches that are also made by LSM. This is a 22 foot-pound, I think it is, 22 foot-pounds, yeah, torque wrench. So if I put it on there and I move it, it's got a little snap breakaway. Please do not over torque these adjusters. You will break them. I see guys do that all the time. They'll come around to where it breaks away, and then they'll give it a little bit more. You don't need to do that, and you are going to fail the adjuster eventually if you keep doing that. So this one I'm going to leave alone. I'm just going to do my intakes and then come back and do my exhaust. So I'm going to move over here to 4. Exhaust just starts opening. Now 4 is ready to go. Grab my feeler gauge. I got a 12. It's hard to see these things. Yeah, that's somewhere around maybe a 13. So maybe 1/1000ths different between those two. Not going to mess with that a whole bunch. Here I go. And same thing there. And that's a little tighter than that one. So where am I at? Oops. If you fold these things up, you got to get them back out again. There we go. And 12 goes in with just a little bit of pressure. So between 12 and 13, all my intakes are great. Now I'm going to do my exhaust. And so when I'm doing my exhaust, I'm looking for the opposite. I want my intake valve to go all the way open and then start closing. Okay, now I know there's no way my exhaust could be open. I'm going to start finding what I got there. Let's see here. 9 goes in, no problem. 10 with a little, oops, I got 2 of them stacked together there. Hang on a second. No editing out my bloopers here, right? Okay, there we go. Had the 10 and 11 there. 10 goes in. That's 10 and 11 with a little bit of effort. Not bad. I'm going to leave that alone too. Okay, so I've gone through, I've checked all my spring loads, happy with that. I've checked all my valve lash, happy with that. So typically if I was doing a dyno session, now I would be ready to take my covers and throw them back on. Basically just come over here, throw my nuts back on both sides, plugs back in, wires back in, I'd be ready to go make another test. So by the way, I was gonna show you guys this plug. This is an O-ring little plug that goes in the back of the dyno and it threads in. We have drilled and tapped it so we could have a thermocouple in there so we could keep track of our water temperature in the brake. But for whatever reason, those brass threads have been stripped and it blew that thing right out there at the end of the run. So I'm really glad that it happened at the very end of the run and not at, right at the beginning of the run and let this thing zing to the moon. But everything about this engine has treated me well. It's been a long project that has really been an amazing journey with so many great people that have helped me along the way. I could not do this by myself without all the people, Aaron at Next Gen and Urachko and Greg Brown at Hammerhead and the guys at Comp and the guys at Jessel and the guys at Driven. I don't know if you guys noticed that green oil in there, but there's 2 types of oil that I use in this thing. When we break these things in and get all the bearings and rings and all that stuff, I usually start with Driven BR30. And then I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but that run was on Driven GP1 5W20 that made 1,198 horsepower. So I don't really get caught up a lot anymore like I used to in a lot of that 0 weight and 2 weight oil. I feel like, yes, there's a tiny bit of power there, but it comes with a lot more maintenance and a lot more effort to use those kinds of oils. So when you're not looking for every little last ounce of power, like maybe in a pro stock engine or something like that, this is supposed to be drag and drive. It's got to run for long periods of time. I'm just not going to lean towards those kinds of oils. So overall, extremely impressive engine. I really love this thing. It's going to be a shame to see it go away, but it's also exciting to see it run. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you like seeing what's inside one of these things and what it takes to make one run. And I can't wait to start on the next project and share that with you guys too. So thanks for watching.